Hello. Welcome to another episode of Ancient Office Hours by the Ozymandias Project. Trireme Transit is now boarding for all new and returning passengers. Now departing, present ponderings. Next stop is Ancient Office Hours at a library lost in the sands of time.
Hey everyone, and welcome to episode 82 of Ancient Office Hours. This week, my guest is friend and colleague Roselyn Campbell, a trained archaeologist, bioarchaeologist, and Egyptologist. She is currently a visiting assistant professor of biological anthropology at the University of California, Riverside, and the assistant director of the UCLA Luskin Center for History and Policy. Her research focuses primarily on understanding violence as a tool of power in the past, but additional interests include the history of cancers in human remains and health and medicine in the ancient world. She has worked at archaeological sites in Egypt, Jordan, Peru, Ethiopia, Spain, and the western United States, and is currently the head bioarchaeologist for projects in Egypt and Jordan. In this episode, we chatted about her path to becoming a bioarchaeologist and Egyptologist, dispelling misconceptions about human sacrifice, power, and violence, and about whether bones and science and true crime media bother bioarchaeologists. I hope you enjoy this episode, and if you like what you hear, please give us a 5-star rating and review us on Apple or Spotify. You can also subscribe to our Patreon, as this will allow us to reach more people and make more exciting ancient world content. Enjoy! Thanks so much for coming on the podcast. I want to start you off with what I'm going to assume would be a really easy question for you to answer, and that's, how old were you when you were like, I love old things and bones and Egypt and ancient things?
I don't really remember exactly how old I was. Like so many people, and this is such a pat answer, but like so many people, I was first interested in mythology. And so when I was a kid, I would read the sanitized children's versions of some of the Greek and Roman myths in particular. And now you know why I said the sanitized children's version. And I was so fascinated by these stories. And I think while I couldn't have articulated at the time, I think what I was really interested in is how people understand the world around them through mythology and religion and things like that. And I really liked Egypt. I liked Greece and Rome and basically all things ancient, but something about Egypt really caught my attention. But it didn't occur to me that it could have been a career until high school, actually. I was reading this series of books by her pen name is Elizabeth Peters. She wrote these Amelia Peabody mysteries. Her real name was Barbara Mertz, and she actually had a PhD in Egyptology from the University of Chicago, which is, of course, one of the premier US institutions for Egyptology. And she wrote these historical fiction novels that were set in the Victorian period, but the protagonist is an archaeologist that works in Egypt. So, of course, because the author was an Egyptologist, there's a whole lot of very accurate information in there, not just about ancient Egypt, but about Egyptology in the Victorian era. And I was reading these and I just remember thinking, oh, wait, you could do this as a job? Is that a thing that people can do? And then it was all over because then I was just fascinated by archaeology. I'd always liked history and mythology, but I think the thing that drew me to archaeology was the discovery aspect of it is so immediately apparent. And so I really started trying to figure out what you need to do to be an archaeologist. And then the bones part of it actually came by accident. So I was taking classes in anthropology because I was at a state school. My university didn't have Egyptology at all. And so in order to study archaeology, I had to study anthropology. And part of that was learning the human body, human evolution, things like that. And I took this osteology class, and I must have been, I guess I would have been a junior probably in college. And I just remember thinking how fascinating it was that you could break a bone and that mark, even once it's totally healed, stays on your body forever. And it sort of blew my mind because I had broken my pelvis a couple years earlier. And I just had this sort of epiphany moment, right? Of, wow, someone could find my bones in 500 or 1,000 years and they would know. They would know that I broke my pelvis, even if it had never been written down, right? This is the thing that attracts me to bioarchaeology. It's the stories that may or may not be written down. And so I sort of accidentally ended up taking all of the classes for bioarchaeology and in undergrad. And so I had a double focus in forensic anthropology and in archaeology. And then I thought, okay, I want to do Egyptology though. Like this was fun, but I'm gonna go back to Egyptology. That's what I'm gonna do. And so I kept TAing the classes for bioarchaeology, but I was like, no, Egyptology. This is what I'm gonna do. And then I started my PhD, and I thought, no, Egyptology. This is what I'm gonna do. And that lasted 6 months. And I realized I am fascinated by the stories we can tell from human bodies. I couldn't leave it behind. So I changed my whole project that I had started for my PhD, which is common. That happens a lot. I just stuck with it, and here we are. So long and complicated answer to your fairly simple question, but there were various stages, right? So
No, I love it. I love it. Because, I mean, most kids either hit like your dinosaur phase, right? Where you're like, I'm going to dig up some dinosaur bones and stuff when you're like, I don't know, 7, 8. And then usually there's like a progression, and then you get into like Egypt and mystery and mythology. And then you go like dinosaur to Egypt or Greece or something, and then you're like, okay, and now I'm in forever and I'm never leaving.
I mean, I think for me, I still am interested in dinosaurs, so that has never died. But I think look with the benefit of hindsight, right? Not at the time, but with the benefit of hindsight, I think I've always been very interested in two things: people and the natural world, which obviously those categories overlap. And so for a long time, I wanted to be a zoologist, right? Because I'm fascinated by animals and how they live within the world and interact with each other and with the natural world. But I've always also been really interested in people as we interact with the natural world as well. And I often tell people sort of half jokingly, oh, I don't like people, blah, blah, blah. And I think in part that's because I am fascinated by people and consistently disappointed that we don't do better. We have such capability to do so many great things. And I think when I sort of half jokingly say, "Oh, I don't like people," it's because we have the possibility to take such better care of our world, to take such better care of each other, and we so frequently choose not to. I think the natural world is fascinating. The ways that the world exists and evolves and changes continues to blow my mind. My friends always not complain, but they're very used to me sending random links. Look at this cool creature that I just found out it exists. Look at this cool thing, this part of the natural world. So I think it's all related, but I could have never articulated that, when I was younger, of course. I would have never said, this is why I like archaeology or paleontology or zoology. But here we are.
This is so funny. I'm like, definitely impressions are like, you sound like the scientist, and so it's very funny to me that you went into like Egyptology as well, because I'm like, oh my god, you'd be perfect. You just need to be, I like envision you just in a lab studying all these things about like nature. So then you come out and you're like dressed in the green fatigues, and you're like, I found this thing. It's really cool, guys. Check this out.
I mean, that's kind of why bioarchaeology is perfect, though, right? Because bioarchaeology is a very science-heavy side of anthropology. So I get to do the part reading Egyptian texts and looking at their culture and all that. And then I go into the lab and I look at the bones and I measure them and I, conduct scientific analyses and I do all that kind of stuff. So it's kind of the perfect marriage of those two things, which I think is why I've never been able to quit bioarchaeology, because it really is, you're always learning something new and different, and you're always discovering something that may be very small and no one else will care about, but you're always discovering something new and different. And I think that's part of why I like it so much. It's the perfect marriage of science and anthropology.
And it's tangible, because, right, like, I just even thinking about when people want to go into these fields, this is probably rude to say to all of my philologist friends, so I apologize in advance. But y'all are a fucking dime a dozen. I'm sorry. But you're reading the same text. Yes, finding a new spin. I get it. Trying to find some cool new translations. But yes, y'all are a dime a dozen. There's all these texts. They're still here. They're not going anywhere. There's nothing like quote unquote new. There's just new interpretation. There's the tangible element, though, of archaeology where you're like, I have material. I can discover more. I can dig it up. I can handle it. I can take it out of the archives and it's not been touched or seen since it was like dug up a billion years ago. It definitely seems new and exciting, and I wish that I'd been more interested in it. I do say I say this toward philologists because I was closer to being one of them than not being one of them. So
Philology is important. Philology is important. I'm glad someone else does it, but it's really important.
exactly. I
Yeah.
was like, y'all, your work is great. Okay, so you chose the tangible path. You got a lot of science in there, which is something that is impressive just because I hated science and I couldn't do it, and it's not for me. So when it came to the languages, though, and since you had this sort of later discovery as we're adding things on in college, I also went to big state school, and it would have been really hard to get all the languages I needed. Was that also an issue for you?
Oh yeah, languages were challenging. So I love languages, but they're not my strong suit. I have to work pretty hard. So I went to a state school, so I was able to study. When I was in undergrad, I studied German and Arabic. I made the questionable choice of learning them both at the same time because when I was in high school, the only language that I was able to access was Spanish, which is important and I'm grateful for, but I didn't get to learn any of these languages that I would use now until college. So I started learning Arabic and German. I was fortunate. I had some really good teachers. Learning them both at the same time was really difficult. I don't know that I recommend that approach, but it was useful. And then when I actually didn't get to learn some of the other languages until much later, I've always really had to hustle for the things that I wanted to do. So while I was doing my master's at a state school, I also did a 3-year online certificate program where I was able to take classes, sort of continuing education classes in Egyptology, very brief introduction to hieroglyphs. I tried to teach myself as much as I could. And then when I started my PhD, I was able to take more formal classes in the ancient Egyptian languages. And I did some French reading and things like that. But languages are an area where I am very jealous of my philology friends who seem to, I'm sure they work very hard, but some people are also just really good at languages. And that is not me. I would love to be. I think languages are fascinating, but that's somewhere where I just have to work pretty hard. It's an ongoing thing. I use a lot of Duolingo to keep my skills fresh, to be perfectly honest.
Yeah, no, that's really, really good. I should probably use Duolingo to help me maintain my one foreign language that I could actively speak, but I don't. Okay, maybe this will be the kick I need, the push to.
It's a way to gamify it, right? So it makes it a little more entertaining, and you can do it in bite-sized doses. So it's not a commercial for Duolingo. They're not paying me or anything, but it is an easy way, and they have a lot of the common languages. So it's an easy way to just keep it in your mind. Because if you don't use it, you do lose it, right?
Yes, languages are hard, and knowing that you want to choose a career that will essentially not even be suggested but like require you to pick up many languages is hard, and for anyone who goes through with it who's not a language whiz, it's impressive. So good for you for working through that, because I'm like that's be like extra masters and then taking more classes and self-teaching and doing all the things. You are like self-made woman over here.
I was also working. It was awful. Yeah.
Oh my God. I was like, how did you live? Oh my gosh.
It probably wasn't very fun to hang around with because I was working my master's. I was working at least part-time the whole time, and sometimes TAing as well. I mean, you got to do what you got to do, right? Not everybody has the resources to just be able to go to school. And so like I said, I've always had to hustle. I've always had to kind of figure out creative ways to get where I wanted to go. That has at times been very, very challenging, but I think it's also made me more creative as a sort of academic and a scholar, because if something is hard or seems impossible, I just figure out another way to do it, because everything has been hard or seemingly impossible. I'm from a small town family of non-academics. Like, it's just a very everything has required extra. You just got to figure it out.
Which is great, because look at you now. Look at you now. So, okay, when you were merging all these great things together, I mean, since you knew you were good at like the science part, did you ever have a moment where you were kind of like, I could just go and work like in, I don't know, the FBI or police department as like the forensic person? And was there any curiosity? Because if you love studying people, which is like good but also bad, because when you see like the worst of humans, it's probably depressing. But like, they need people like you with your skill set who are like, yeah, let's analyze the shit out of these psychos and then look at the evidence and whatever.
Oh, absolutely. I have those moments now. I think anyone who says that they don't have those moments is either in denial, or maybe they're just really content, I guess. But academia is a tough business and it is not kind. So I think everybody I know has at some point considered what would happen if they worked outside academia. I think for me, it is something I still think about, right? Because I also think, one of my particular areas of interest is in studying how violence becomes sanctioned by a culture or a state. And of course, that does have relevance now. And so one of the things I often think about is, what is my ethical responsibility to the population at large, right? Because the past is great and interesting, but people are living and hurting and dying now. So I think that is something that, at least in my profession, you should think about. I think for me, most days I like to stick with the ancient world as much as I can. That doesn't mean I always will, but right now there are a few reasons why I want to do that. One is that it takes an enormous emotional and mental toll even to look at these really extreme examples of violence in the past, much more in the present. And I am a person who really empathizes with others. And so that was kind of a conscious choice that I made. I had a lot of friends that were doing forensics and things like that. And part of my thought process was, I don't really want to be that person who is identifying the lost and murdered child of someone who is still living, which perhaps is weakness, but I think there's a place for all of us, in the world. And I think even with the ancient cases, it does take a toll, because just as you said, you start thinking about, you're constantly thinking about how awful people are, and not just how awful people are. My research is about how we pat ourselves on the back for being awful, right? We culturally sanction some extreme violence like genocide, war, all sorts of different examples throughout history. And so it really does sort of sour you on people in some ways. So I think for me right now, I feel like the best way I can give back while also keeping my mental health somewhat intact is focusing on the past, but also drawing parallels to the present. Because I do think there's the danger that we get so comfortable with the past that we don't want to enter the present. I'm very privileged that I get to work on something that I am interested in that mostly pays my bills. That is a huge privilege. That has not been my background, growing up. That was a strange concept. So I try to also keep that in mind, that while I can do this, that's great. But I also try to never forget that this is an enormous privilege, that I don't have to just go out and get any job that will pay the bills so that I can survive. I have been fortunate enough to find ways to do what I like and mostly pay the bills. But I still think about it, not just the FBI, but, there are anthropologists who work on all sorts of different aspects of violence and incarceration. There are people who study, incarceration and prisons and how those are designed not to rehabilitate people, right? But to keep them locked down and to break their spirit. And there's all sorts of different things that you could explore. Right now, I'm fortunate to study ancient Egypt, which I like, but also feel like I'm giving back in some way.
Well, let's get to Egypt then, because yes, we've been talking a lot about the cool, different way that like people who are really big into bioarchaeology have to come up, which is a bit different from others. But okay, so on the Egypt side, people don't really tend, right, to associate ancient Egypt with human sacrifice the way that, say, we do with the Aztecs or the Maya or something like that. But obviously you still get to study all these cool dead people from Egypt. So could you tell me and my audience, like, so I want to study like human sacrifice and dead people in Egypt. What is this all about? What have you found out? Like, what's going on there?
That is a great and complex question. Basically, what I studied for my PhD, there is these groups of burials that surround the royal tombs from the first dynasty, right? So roughly 3000 BCE, about 5,000 years ago. And this is sort of the period where Egypt is becoming a more or less united state. Okay, not overnight, right? And there's tons of debate about exactly how it happened. It is at this period that we start to see all of these different groups that already lived in Egypt with their distinct cultures and their trade and their own burial patterns. They start to be consolidated under a single king, which is important because if we look cross culturally, this is sort of the prime circumstances for when you might expect to see a particular type of human sacrifice, because you're inserting a divine or semi-divine king where there wasn't one before, and you have to convince a large populace not to overthrow said king, right? Or just ignore said king, right? Somehow, and the Nile Valley is a long place. There are people that would have lived their entire lives, as well as their children and their grandchildren, without ever having probably seen the king, right? So how do you convince all of these people to let this king rule? And this is not specific to Egypt, right? We see this in other places, Mesopotamia as well. But one of the ways that a new king will do this in a newly established state is often to perform human sacrifice, because this is a very visceral and public way of showing everyone that you quite literally control life and death, right? I can command that this person dies, this person lives, and just because I'm king, because I can do that. That is very powerful, right? And so we have these, we call them subsidiary graves because they surround the royal tombs. There's a whole bunch of them, sometimes a dozen, sometimes hundreds. We only see this in the first dynasty when Egypt is becoming established. And when these graves were first found, there was talk that maybe they represented human sacrifice, right? Because you have these hundreds of tombs around a king's burial. And isn't this interesting? We don't see this same pattern later in Egyptian history. And so the idea when they were found was maybe they're human sacrifice. And to put this in context, the majority of this discussion was happening right around the time that Leonard Woolley discovered the royal tombs at Ur, early 20th century, 1910s, 1920s. And so this had really captured the public's imagination, right? The royal tombs at Ur are spectacular. And the idea at the time when they were found, because these bodies are all carefully laid out, they have their beautiful headdresses, their chariots. And so the interpretation was, oh, they must have, all of these people must have gone into the tomb and, you know, there's no evidence for violence. So they must have just willingly drunk poison and laid down peacefully and died in the service of their eternal ruler, right? To serve him or her in the afterlife. And then the king or queen, in one case at least, goes into the afterlife with all of these attendants and officials, and right, this beautiful, picturesque, tragic image. So this is in part, I think, what influenced the interpretation of the Egyptian examples as well. But there are some differences. So, for example, a few years ago, someone reanalyzed the royal burials at Ur, some of the human remains, and said, hey, actually, by the way, some of these individuals have massive cranial trauma, but the then headdresses and things like that were arranged to cover it. So it is possible that some drank poison. That's very difficult to prove in the archaeological record, especially from thousands of years ago, but at least some were definitely bashed on the head. And I do think we need to at least mention here the impact of colonialism and Orientalism, because at this time there were a lot of Europeans going to places like the Middle East and Egypt, and because it was so considered so exotic, you know, and look at these exotic, and I'm saying this in quotes, right, barbaric, according to the Europeans, these foreign people who practice sacrifice. Oh my goodness, we would never do this. This is so exotic. Of course, we know that the early Europeans, there's lots of human sacrifice. That's ridiculous. But we do need to consider the impact of Orientalism and colonialism at this time. So coming back to the Egyptian examples, When they were found, the excavator around the 1920s said, it doesn't look like there's any evidence for physical trauma, so they must have drunk poison or been buried alive, right? And then this is where things really took off. The excavator said maybe they were buried alive because some of the bodies show evidence of movement after having been laid in the graves. So that was about 100 years ago, right? We'll sort of fast forward. And for about the last century, people have debated this a bit, but mostly just accepted what the excavator said. So there's been two camps. One side says there's no evidence of trauma, which means it surely was not sacrifice. Personally, I do think this is a little bit of a holdover from Orientalism, that instead of saying these people were so barbaric, it's a sort of intense feeling that the Egyptians were better than everybody else, and so thus would have never conducted human sacrifice, because that is such a terrifying, crazy thing. And I think that's partly a holdover from Orientalism, partly, we've bought into the ancient Egyptian propaganda, which says Egypt was better than everyone, right? And I think we need to be conscious of that. The other camp says, yes, of course, it does seem very likely that it happened. I mean, the archaeological context fits, right? State formation, new king. There's all these graves. Some people think that a bunch of them were closed at the same time, which would suggest people didn't just die naturally and great individually. But there hasn't really been a lot of research done onto, hey, maybe we should actually reanalyze this, right? In part because the original excavator also only kept the crania, or the heads. He actually reburied the rest of the bodies because at the time it was believed that you could get more or less all the information you needed from the cranium, which is definitely not the case. But we work with what we have. Enter me, who was interested in violence and anthropology and ancient Egypt. And I thought, hey, maybe I'll take a look at these crania, these heads that do survive. They're very few. From the hundreds that were originally buried, the graves were disturbed over thousands of years. When they were excavated, most of them were already gone, and then some were lost somewhere along the way. And so we only have a few dozen left. But when I looked at them, what I found was that we do actually have some evidence for perimortem, or around the time of death, trauma in these heads, right? So not what we would expect, the Mesopotamian examples, but definitely trauma that could have caused death. And it's not in everyone, but it is pretty common. And so my argument has been sort of twofold. One side does look like there was sacrifice here. And I think that's important. And we need to talk about how that would have been viewed in ancient Egypt. But I think the other side is that we really need to add more nuance to what it is we think sacrifice looks like in archaeology. Because just as you said, right, everybody thinks of the Aztecs. And that is a type of sacrifice, but there are different types of human sacrifice. Sometimes you sacrifice people to cause pain and blood and suffering, and that is the point of the sacrifice. Other times you want an individual to enter the afterlife, to accompany a king or a ruler or their spouse or whatever else. So the purpose might not be to cause intense pain and blood, but rather you can only get to the afterlife if you're dead. So sorry, buddy, you have to die. I mean, I realize that's being a bit glib about it, but I think if we expect everything to look like the Aztecs, which is the most, I think, at least in the mind of the public, the spectacular example, I think we're going to miss a lot. And we're not going to be able to talk about conversations like, what is violence and how did the ancient Egyptians view different types of violence? Because we in the modern world can't even agree on what counts as violence and what doesn't. So why do we assume that we know exactly what people 5,000 years ago viewed as violence or sacrifice? And so I think for me, it's an opportunity to ask more questions, which I actually love. I think that's great. I love that in archaeology, there are answers, but there's always more questions. I think that's great. It's always something new to look for.
That is great. That is great. And it's so cool because like that simple line of questioning and those simple ideas, it extends so far out that like you can go into interdisciplinary ways. Because one of the things I looked at in my master's program was issues of cultural heritage, and I got way big into essentially like the destruction of monuments, like cultural heritage monuments. And I was like, that's a type of violence. But like, did ancient people, when they destroyed statues, was that also violent too? So I love all these questions about violence.
Yeah, this is the question, right? Is it only violence if you're causing harm to a person, right? Or what about an object, right? What if the violence is, structural violence, denying certain groups of people in our modern society or past access to education, food, water, shelter, right? How do we treat refugees, right? Is that a structural form of violence that we don't allow refugees or immigrants necessarily access to resources? What about things like a virus? Is that violent? Because it is something that is attacking another body, right? I think these questions are really interesting. I don't know that there is one answer, right? I think everything is context specific, but it is interesting once you really start thinking about, yeah, what counts as violence?
I love it. I mean, and that's what we do here, connect modern societies to ancient worlds and ancient problems and lines of thought. So, but okay, so the Egypt specific part is super interesting and it just brings up all these great questions. But also, I'm a little curious when you talk to other people who may not be in either of the fields. Do you primarily identify yourself as both, or do you kind of have to like pick one and tell people, oh, I'm an Egyptologist, but I do sort of like the material culture side? Or do you tell people, no, I'm a bioarchaeologist, but I study Egypt. That's my chosen region.
That's a great question. It's a mix. It kind of depends who I'm talking to. The interesting thing about interdisciplinary work is that you're often having to convince everyone that you do all of the things. So I often feel that I have to convince Egyptologists that just because I do bioarchaeology doesn't mean I can't do Egyptology also, and vice versa, right? I think the thing I love about bioarchaeology is that most bioarchaeologists have a region that they specialize in. Because the whole point of bioarchaeology is that you're not just looking at the human remains, you are looking at the human remains in their cultural context. So you want to know something about the culture. So if I'm just meeting a random person on the street, I will usually say something along the lines of, I study human remains mostly from ancient Egypt. Because I also work in Jordan. I've worked in Peru several times. I've worked around the world. I worked in Spain. I worked in various places. And the term bioarchaeology is one that is primarily used within academia. And so I want to be understood. And if I'm speaking to someone who may not have heard that term, then I will just say, I study human remains from ancient Egypt, which usually means they ask me if I study mummies, which I do, but mostly I work on skeletal remains. But yeah, I usually do a little bit of both, but I usually also add the sort of disclaimer that I work other places as well, which is one of the beauties of having a specialty like bioarchaeology. There are bones everywhere.
Yeah, though, and I was gonna say for getting on digs for most people who don't know the process or how one just like goes to these places and explores, is it easier for you to get yourself onto a project because you have a specialized skill set like this, where other people might just be like, I want to go and I want to try the digging in a trench and let's see what happens, right?
Easier is tough. I think the advantage I have is that I am able to join projects in other parts of the world. And so there have been cases where, the project in Jordan I joined last year, and it was because a former colleague of mine said, hey, we found some human remains. We don't have a specialist. Do you want to come join? And I had been to Jordan as a tourist. I love Jordan. And I'm always looking to work new places. And so I said, yes, I'd love to. And while I may not know as much about the culture as I do about Egyptology, it is also not so foreign that I can't learn. And of course, you're always working collaboratively, right? I think the challenge is, again, like I mentioned before, being interdisciplinary, you really do have to kind of get your name out there. And so a lot of projects, we all have our colleagues and friends. And so I'm relatively early in my career. People don't know who I am. I'm not particularly famous. So, I have to sort of reach out to people. I did once get on a project where someone was giving a public talk and said, I just can't find anybody to study the human remains. And they said it like twice. And finally, I raised my hand during the question and Q&A period. And I said, I study human remains in Egypt. I would love to. And that was a fantastic project. Fantastic. So it varies. I think I have the advantage of being able to jump around to different parts of the world, which I really enjoy. I love to go to new places, but it does also mean I have to sometimes seek out those opportunities because, if I don't work in all parts of the world, the people that work there are not going to know who I am, right? So, I have a few colleagues that work in China, but there are other bioarchaeologists who work in China. I am not going to be the name that they immediately think of. So it's a mix. It does give me a broader range, I think, than if I only studied Egyptology because I can expand, which is I like the diversity of it.
Well, it seems like it's really handy and an argument for going into something just a little broader that might end up helping you find sort of consistent opportunities or consistent work if one is willing to go out and seek them. I don't know. It's quite split because I definitely talk to friends who, they're only in classics or another field. And, well, with Greece, it's not, there's a lot of projects, so you can just apply and go. But yeah, for some of these other places, I would imagine it may be a bit harder. So it's good to have that adaptability and everything. So remind me if I'm wrong, but I believe Kara was on your dissertation committee at UCLA?
Yeah, she was actually my advisor. Yep.
Okay. And since you were doing kind of a two-pronged thing, you had two advisors, right?
I started with two, yeah. But you sort of usually end up with one towards the end anyways. But I also worked with people outside of UCLA because UCLA doesn't really have they don't really have any bioarchaeology. And so the only reason I was able to do that was because I had that background in anthropology and bioarchaeology. And I continued to find projects and training and things like that outside of UCLA as well. And that is one of the benefits of the project or the program that I was in at UCLA. It is quite literally the interdisciplinary program in archaeology. And so there was a little bit more flexibility in that I was expected to work with other people. I was expected to have a specialty, not just geographically, but methodologically, bioarchaeology, right? And it was sort of assumed that I would work with people outside of UCLA as well. That was really nice because it really lends itself to interdisciplinary work. And of course, Kara is also very interested in these broad social questions. And I think that was really helpful to have her input as I'm looking at broad patterns of violence and anthropology and theory, to have her also being interested in those broad patterns and, what parallels do we see in the present? And I think that was really interesting to be able to work with her in that way. And we're still friends. We still work on things together, which is really fun.
Which is awesome. I had great mentors and professors and advisors and stuff. So anytime I could pick them up, I'm like, yep, keep them coming. Love it. Amazing people. Learned so much. So the reason I brought her up, really, other than she's awesome, is that she is more visible than a lot of people in academia. And she's been able to spin that into great opportunities. I grew up watching her show Out of Egypt. It was one of the reasons I wanted to get into the ancient world. It was one of the reasons I thought I was going to be a baby Egyptologist once upon a time when I was in 7th grade. But anyway, so because she's had these great opportunities, were you at all influenced? And since you also had this great, very interdisciplinary background, do you dream sometimes what could you do if someone was like, yes, Discovery comes to you and they go, Rose, yes, make a great show about violence and human sacrifice a la Out of Egypt. Is this something that you're like, oh, this would be great? What could you spin it? If you had the opportunity, would you make that show?
I think it would depend on how it was packaged, because I think my concern, Kara has been able to really, because she was so involved with the production of that show, she was able to make sure that the narrative was accurate and not sensationalist in a way that a lot of shows sometimes are. And so I think I would certainly be interested in the show. I am not opposed to archaeology on TV. I think that is an interesting topic of debate amongst academics. And I think the reality is, it's just like you said, right? People watch these shows. And so I think it's important to make these shows. But I also think it's important to make quality shows. And I think it would depend on how it was couched and if I trusted the producers and the people making it to tell a nuanced and important story in a way that was packaged for a public audience. Because I think in this era of 50 million streaming services and everybody is making their own shows, the onus is kind of on us as experts in some ways to make sure that we're presenting something that is accurate, that is as factual as we can be, but also acknowledges what we don't know. Because that is something I see a lot in other shows, is that things are presented as if they're definitely known or facts. And if that's not your background, if that's not your field, you don't know that it's one theory of five. How could you possibly know? And I think it's really important as experts to show the public that we also don't know everything, and that's okay. But we have done a ton of research, and this is why we think this is the most likely explanation. So I certainly wouldn't turn it down if it was well done. I don't particularly love being on camera, but I also think it's really important to interface with the public, because I think we owe that to the public as people who are privileged to work in a very specialized field. I think it's important to be able to share that knowledge with others, right? People are interested in Egypt. People are interested in what relevance 5,000 years ago has today. So I think it's important, but it depends how it's done.
I would agree. I do a second podcast with a fellow ancient historian friend. She actually is an Assyriologist, but we basically have taken it upon ourselves to read and watch and consume media and books and all this stuff based on or set in the ancient world. And let me tell you, I have seen so many bad Iliad and Odyssey adaptations within the last year that we've been doing this podcast that I completely agree. I'm like, oh God, please not another one. Please do it well. Please do it well. I'm begging you, please do it well. So I understand that side for sure of classical reception and any kind of ancient world reception. But there's so many different ways that we do it. Little Bird told me that you got to play Assassin's Creed Origins like before it came out. And that's like super exciting. But so how much of it was like you had to turn off academic brain for creative license versus, no, this is wrong, you need to fix this because this is just fucking shit and it's terrible?
That is a great question. And I think I am not necessarily in the majority here. So I really enjoy a lot of popular media about the ancient world. I love the Brendan Fraser mummy movies. I love the Assassin's Creed games. I do think we need to acknowledge that ancient history as it is not always the most entertaining for the average audience. So I think there is always going to be a place for adapting the ancient world to the public in ways that are slightly more interesting than some of our own research. I include my own, right? I love Assassin's Creed Origins. I don't have that much of a problem turning off the academic brain to play it. I think where I really enjoy those games and others is in the critical analysis of them, right? So I know some people were really bothered by the inaccuracies, of which there are many, and many of those were made for entertainment purposes, which is fair, because you know what? Those games are hugely popular. So they're clearly doing something right. I love that game. I've played the whole game. It's very fun. I mean, for me, I think it's more productive to enjoy it, but then have that active conversation of, okay, let's look at the inaccuracies and talk about how that's inaccurate and why it's inaccurate and where do we go from here, right? I'm not going to say that every game needs to be 100% accurate. How would you even do that? We don't know every single aspect of the ancient world or the modern world. How would you even do that? So I don't really have a problem with that. I think the problem, just as we were just talking about with TV programs and things, is if it's uncritically presented as this is 100% accurate, which means the audience then might uncritically receive it as this is 100% accurate. For me, I had a great time. I was like, oh, this is so cool. And one of the things I love about video games is also what I love about archaeology. You get the opportunity to immerse yourself in a world. Archaeology is about re-envisioning life in the past. And especially with games like Assassin's Creed that are based in real time periods and real locations, obviously with, added elements, you get to immerse yourself in that world. And so I think that's fantastic because you can write about the ancient world forever, but once you're in a game or in a movie or in a TV show and you see like, oh wow, yeah, look at how small the house is in real life. Look at, you can see those monuments from here. Look at all the crops growing and how green it is. Those are the kind of things that I think are hard to envision unless you can visualize them in a game or a TV show or something.
So as one who really most of anything I learned about Egypt, since my university did not have anything about Egyptology, I learned from books primarily. And, you see the old photos and you can watch movies and stuff, but they always kind of... I have a problem with them because they always show Egypt in ruin. It's never like Egypt during its height. It's always like it's in ruin and everything's crumbling. But I think until I saw Assassin's Creed, I didn't know how green it was. And I was like, oh my God, it's so green and lush. Why doesn't anyone fucking say this? Now I can go and read it in a book, but I have to like find the book and I have to find like the section that talks about the flora and fauna. And as one from outside the field, and for many people who are not even really attuned to any kind of academia, they're not going to really want to probably do that. So yeah, I was quite impressed with how green it was. And I have a colleague who, yes, the thing he hates most are the mangoes.
I have heard this complaint, yes.
But I was like, it is just such a small, minute thing that I was like, look, man, it's a color palette thing. And also, I love the color palette of that game. I think it is gorgeous. So I was like, it's fine. We're good. And yeah, I think it's precisely because they are allowed to put some inaccuracies in the games that allows for that critical sort of analysis. So that's one of the things we work on when I put my Archeo gaming videos into the classroom. I'm like, let's talk about it's wrong in the game. Let's talk about this because, that would be boring if everything was hyper accurate and then we had nothing to talk about. But okay, so we have clearly, when you study the ancient world, a lot of different forms of reception, either video games, TV, film, whatever. As ancient historians, we have clearly a lot that we love and a lot that we can harp on. I'm curious, for the more forensic anthropology side, one, do you watch things like, I don't know, those crime shows, CSIs or whatever, the Law and Orders, and does it bother you? Like, as I know doctors, they complain about Grey's Anatomy all the time because it's completely wrong. But does it bother you when you're like, oh no, this lab seat is wrong? They would never do that. They would never wear that. Oh no.
Sometimes. I really enjoyed Bones, the TV show Bones, for many years. I do have trouble with some of the other shows. So I have watched some CSI, perfectly fine show. I think for me, as a scientist, when I see that there's sort of one person doing the quote unquote science and they sort of turn around results in like a day, that is a little bit frustrating because I'm like, man, wouldn't that be nice? Yeah, that'd be really freaking great if we could, just sort of stick a random hair in a machine and be like, well, here's the DNA profile and here's how old they were and here's what they did for a living. That would be great. I enjoyed Bones for many, many years, and those were actually written by a forensic anthropologist, the original books. I found those a little more manageable, and they are kind of fun. But that one I think also I liked because I liked the characters. So that helps. I don't really watch true crime. And I think it's in part because I spend my time researching. I do like reading fictional mysteries, murder mysteries and things like that. But I think it's because in fiction, everything works out and there's resolution, which is usually not the case in real life. And so I enjoy fictional murder mysteries because the perpetrator is usually caught. There is some sense of justice and closure, and it's a mystery. And I love a mystery. Yeah, that's not always the case in true crime, But I do enjoy some of the fictional shows. And I love a good mystery. Murder mysteries are particularly interesting. Books and movies and shows, but some of the actual forensic shows I struggle with a little bit.
Hard not to blame you. I mean, definitely, I have many doctors and nurses in my family, and none of them watch any of the medical shows because they're like, I just can't. It's too wrong. As one who doesn't even like sciencey things for the most part, it was very funny. I grew up watching Law and Order SVU with my mom. The medical examiner, Dr. Warner, I think is her name. She was always my favorite. And so I was like, more scenes in the lab, please. Let's have her talk to me about what's going horribly wrong with the dead person. And then I was like, that's a terribly awful, morbid thing to say. And then I was like, maybe I shouldn't say that out loud. But I did love her.
Well, and I think part of my problem with those shows, you know, if you like going back to the mangoes in Assassin's Creed, how much does that really impact what people view as ancient Egypt, right? There are other things that are a little bit more problematic. What I think part of my problem with a lot of the forensic shows is they have become so popular and they've really taken hold in people's imaginations. And so now there's this idea that if you study forensics, you can immediately identify a missing person. You know, you can there's so many things, that there's so much information that you should be able to find. You should be able to provide all of these answers. And I think that can be harmful, because if your loved one is missing or has been killed, you want answers, and you're going to be really frustrated if someone can't give them to you. But the reality is, we can almost never get the level of detail that is shown in the forensic shows. That's just not half of that. Well, 3/4 of that technology doesn't even exist, right? And even if we had the technology, you know, there's degradation from environment or, you know, circumstances or whatever else. And I think that is part of what concerns me about some of those shows. It's not just, oh, they're doing analysis really quickly. They're so popular that people now think that if you study human remains, you can immediately tell all of these things just, you know, after a day or an hour or whatever. And that, I think, has the potential to maybe not increase suffering, but not necessarily mitigate suffering, right? If you're looking for a loved one or you're trying to find answers.
Yeah, well, you know, take any media, right, with a
Of course.
big grain of
course.
salt. No, it's interesting to hear though, because you know, I spend so much of my time, and I know a lot about the reception of the ancient world, but you know, it doesn't normally occur to me, you know, oh, I wonder, is this also as big of an issue in other fields as well, very contemporary ones? And the answer, I guess, is yes.
There is actually a name for it. Yeah. So yeah, because it does mean that forensics classes at universities are usually quite full because everybody wants to do it, but the jobs are harder to get. So everybody takes a forensic class, and then people think they're just going to get those jobs. But yeah, no, it's called the CSI effect. It is a thing.
Oh, okay. Well, now I know what it's called. Yes, that is very helpful to know. So I am just quickly curious. We have a lot of ancient world things, and we have a lot of those true crime type of things. We don't have much media that crosses the two over. We have, you know, some select examples. So ideally, if you could do a crossover between two shows, what would you put together to make this like beautiful mix of ancient history and like forensics?
Oh, you mean if I could cross two shows that currently exist? Oh, that's a good question. Boy, I don't know, because I mean, forensics as a field didn't necessarily exist in the ancient world, at least as far as we know. I mean, I can say my sort of two favorites, which would be Bones and the Brendan Fraser mummy movies, which you could potentially cross over, I suppose, if you made murder mysteries set in ancient Egypt. And one of the things I love about the mummy movies is the completely ridiculous reenactments. I love them. They are, you know, there's all sorts of crazy things. But as we talked about earlier, being able to visualize things like that is pretty cool. So I think you could potentially do something like that. I mean, Agatha Christie wrote at least one, I can't remember if there was two, murder mysteries set in ancient Egypt. That there is sort of precedent for that. But maybe something like that where, yeah, or maybe like Bones, but you're trying to solve an ancient mystery. I don't know. That's a good question.
Yeah, it's meant to trip you up because I don't believe me. I wouldn't even have an answer for what I would cross over for
Yeah.
classics and something very contemporary. So just a little fun thing to think about. Yeah. So I'm also again very curious to know, as the bone person, which I really can count on maybe one hand how many people I know who are like, yes, I have that bone friend who just knows things, right? As a classicist myself, and then having a lot of friends study the ancient world, if you see something on TV or you just get asked like, oh, is this accurate? Or they turn to you and just say, can you identify this by looking at it? If you're in a museum or something. So how often would you say people come up to you and just go, "Oh yeah, you do ancient world, but also you're bone lady. So here," and then pick up like a random thing or point to a random photo of a bone and go, "Can you identify this?"
Fairly often, actually. I once had a student who showed up and said, "Look at this bone that I found," and it was a picture. And I said, "Oh yeah, it looks like a deer bone of some kind." And they were like, "Oh man, I was trying to trip you up." And I was like, "No," but fairly often, actually, because the general public and even law enforcement, if you find a random bone on the side of the road or in, I don't know, while you're hiking or something, you might not be able to tell if it's human or non-human. So that is actually the most common thing that happens, is someone will be hiking or doing this, or they'll see a picture of something and they'll show me a picture and say, "Hey, what do you think this is?" It's almost always not human, right? There's a lot of animals in the world, and especially if you're out in the forest or hiking or whatever else, it's usually just, yeah. So it happens more than you would think. I think it also depends who you're talking to, of course. Yeah, more often than you'd think. I've also had a lot of, because I do have friends who are true crime enthusiasts, and no shade whatever on that, because true crime is interesting. It's just I don't listen to it that often, but I have had a lot of discussions with people about things that probably shouldn't be said in public, like how do you get rid of a body and would this actually work? Not planning, but just curiosity, right? Like people, because you see all these shows, these TV shows, and these murder mysteries and things like that. And so I have had a lot of discussions with people about, would this actually work? Like, could you actually get rid of a body this way? Again, not planning. I don't know anyone to my knowledge who is trying to get rid of a body. But as a thought experiment, I've definitely had those conversations. And occasionally I have to remind myself that I am in public and it might be weird if people were listening. And so I do try to, because, I can sit there and talk about decomposition over lunch, doesn't bother me. But not everyone has the same feelings. So I do try to keep that in mind.
Interesting. Yeah, I'd like to think I have a strong stomach, but I'm not gonna test that theory. But it is funny, yes, because as a thought experiment, sometimes I definitely have said to a friend or two, or maybe more, I don't know, "Oh, I don't like this person. If I were to murder someone, you would be the person I'd call to help me drag the body across the living room floor." I'm not planning to murder anyone, I promise.
Also,
But
that would leave a lot of trace evidence if you dragged it across the living room floor. Just I mean, but don't murder someone anyways. But you will definitely get caught.
yeah, I was also like, when you think about it, I was like, actually, you wouldn't want to do that because, yeah, you would definitely.
You also shouldn't murder. Just to be clear for anyone listening, you should not murder.
Don't murder. Don't do bad things. Bad things will come back and haunt you. Also, they're just bad things. But yeah, well, on that lovely note, I do have a couple of questions to sort of, close us out of this interview portion, because I could go on and on and on, and I'm sure you could too, but we'd be like 100 years old, and yeah. Anyway, when you were in college, like you can undergrad, master's, grad school, whatever time you can point to, did you attend your professor's office hours?
Yes, I did. Not just to ask questions, but to ask them about their experiences and their background and advice. And you can learn really interesting things and meet really interesting people. And especially in big classes, your professor, however nice they may be, might not know who you are. And so, yes, I did. Not always, but usually, if it was a class I was interested in, I would usually go to office hours at some point.
Nice. And do you have like a particular, I don't know, like an instance or conversation or just like something that really stood out to you that you really loved from one of these either formal or informal office hours?
Good question. Not necessarily a particular instance. I think what I remember more is the overall impression that I received from several of my professors over time that I could potentially succeed at what I was trying to do, if that makes sense. Because I think sometimes you talk with professors who I'm sure are perfectly lovely people, but they're busy or they have things going on in their lives, and that's totally okay. I'm not critiquing in any way. But I think there were also several professors who really went above and beyond and made me feel believed in, I guess. Unlike maybe I could have the potential, because nobody in my family had a PhD, nobody, archaeology was such a pipe dream, it's not something that I should have really considered if I was being practical, I guess. But people believed in me, I think, in some way. And so I felt like, well, maybe, and I think that overall impression is really powerful. Everybody needs someone to believe in you sometimes.
Yeah. I mean, I loved it when I had teachers, mentors, other people. I mean, yes, my parents always did, but I would always say, yeah, but you're my parents, so you have to believe in me. Yeah, it's definitely a special feeling when someone sort of is invested, right, in your success, in your future, and cares to see you through it. I mean, I had my favorite professor from undergrad had a chocolate drawer. So one, I just wanted to go get chocolate. But two, she was so lovely and willing to help for everything outside of academia. So she, I went into her office in tears once, and she was like, "Oh no, what's going on?" Thinking like I got a bad grade, and I was like, "I don't know how to do my taxes, and I'm gonna go to jail." And so she was like, "Oh no, poor thing. Here, I'm gonna teach you how to do your taxes." So she taught me how to do taxes, which I think I've forgotten by now, which is terrible. But she taught me how to do it, and I didn't go to jail.
Always a plus. Well, and sometimes it's little things. In fact, last weekend, I randomly at the airport ran into a professor I had in undergrad, and I just said, "Hey, just you probably don't remember me, but I wanted to say thanks. It was cool." And he did remember me, actually, many years ago. And I think even stuff like that, people want to feel like they matter, right? And so I think even those small circumstances where someone teaches you to do your taxes or someone remembers you after 15 years, it's something that makes you feel like you matter. And it then in turn allows you to believe in yourself and to believe in other people, right? So I think that those little things matter.
They do. They restore my faith in humanity. A smidge. There's so much else that needs to be done. But okay, I'm going to turn the chair around, so to speak, on you. And as an educator yourself now, is dealing with students and teaching classes, if you were going to, pitch students on the virtues of coming to an office hours chat, what would you tell them?
This is a constant battle. I'm always trying to get students to come to office hours. I think what I try to tell students is that in the classroom, I'm trying to educate you in a way that is accessible to everyone. But I don't know your individual background. I don't know your circumstances. I don't know your native language. I don't know much about you. If you come to office hours, I can learn a little bit more about you, and I can try to meet you where you individually are. And that's really important for me because I come from a very different background than most of my peers in graduate school. And there were a lot of things that I didn't know, and a lot of things that I didn't know. And if you don't talk to anybody, nobody can help you and no one can tell you. And there's no shame in not knowing. I think that's really important to convey, especially for first-gen students. I was a first-generation graduate student. And there is some support for first-generation undergrad students, which is good. There should be more, but it's good. There's almost none for first-generation graduate students. And I think I often felt overwhelmed, and I would get sort of social anxiety about what are the things that I don't know. And so I really try to encourage students to come to my office hours because I want to help you. I am literally here to help you. But I can't help you if I don't know that, your home life is really stressful, or, you don't understand the words I'm speaking because you haven't heard them before, or this isn't your native language. All of those things I can try to help you with if I know that they're happening. And I like to talk to students and learn about their lives and their interests. And then I can maybe point them in the direction of books or classes or other professors that they might really like to learn from. So I think students are sometimes intimidated to go to office hours, but I also think you got to give your professors a chance, because a lot of us really do want to meet you where you're at, and we really do want to help you and talk to you, but you got to give us the chance. And in the classroom, it's just not possible in the same way, especially in the big classes. But it's just not, you've got anywhere from half a dozen to hundreds of people that you're trying to reach at the same time. It's just not, you can't talk in the same way.
No, I totally agree. Also, because just because I lived in my professor's office, I would see like the people who would come at the end of the semester who'd never showed up before. I just need that extra couple percentage points to get myself up from that like B to a B plus or whatever the grade may be. And by then your professor's like, well, where have you been all semester? I don't know you. I don't really feel like I should help you get the higher grade. So there's that too. Just being real.
It's hard. I mean, I think there's this impression that professors are out to get the students or don't want to help them. I think that's almost never the case. Most of the time, we'd be very happy to help you, but you also have to as a student, have to take responsibility for your actions. And if you decide not to come to class and then show up in the last week and want to know why you didn't get a good grade, that's why. You're a grown up. You have to take responsibility for your actions too. I want to help you, but I can't help you if you don't come to class and don't show up, right? It's just like people always say, half of the battle is showing up. I can't help you if you're not there to help, So I think that's important too. But I would say it's almost never the case that a professor is actually out to get students or wants them to fail or anything like that. I mean, half the conversations I have with my colleagues are, how do we meet students where they're at and help them succeed, right? I can't give you success, but I want to give you the tools to succeed. We talk about that a lot. We really do. That is a very serious concern that we are trying to solve.
Okay. I don't normally ask a bonus question about office hours, but I have to ask you a bonus question about office hours because I can't help myself and I want to. There's this impression I've noticed that, especially with like female professors or TAs or whatever, right, that like, oh, she's chill, she'll help me, she's the least scary of if it's between her and like a male professor who you assume is just gonna be like, nope, and then you walk out of the room. Do you find that some people will come and try to have their way because, oh, well, she's small in stature like me, and so she doesn't seem particularly terrifying, so maybe I can go get my way and help myself?
Oh, all the time. All the time. Yeah. And because I smile and I'm friendly and I look relatively young. So yes, very often. And sometimes they react very negatively when I don't simply hand out good grades, because at the end of the day, I want to help you. But really what I'm most interested in is giving you the tools to succeed in life. I can't just hand you a diploma. You'll do poorly in everything else because you didn't have to work for it, right? So what I'm most interested in is helping you help yourself a little bit. But that is it. Yes, I have had that very frequently. I have had very different reactions from students who, when I'm teaching a class that is in my specialty and someone else, a man, is teaching it even though it's not his specialty, my comment, the comments from the students are usually somewhere along the lines of, she's so nice and she cares, instead of she actually knows what she's talking about, which is a little frustrating, but that is a widespread problem in academia, right? Women are perceived as, they are expected to be caring and motherly and kind, and are across the board tend to be perceived as less authoritative and knowledgeable simply by virtue of being a woman. So yes, and I mean, I am friendly. I do want to help. I do care a great deal about my students. I lose sleep over some of the things that my students go through and some of the situations that they have. But that also doesn't mean I don't know what I'm talking about. And it also doesn't mean that I'm going to automatically hand you an A because you didn't show up for class and then showed up the last day and smiled at me. No. So I think that's a very difficult line to walk, but that's also the line of just about any woman in academia. And it's worse for women of color. Like there's so many groups that have it much harder, right? So women of color, transgender scholars, like there's just a lot of groups that have it harder than me. So I certainly have a certain level of privilege, but definitely there are differences based on gender, for sure.
So disappointing that we're still dealing with these questions in 2023, almost 2024. But you know what? Human species, as you probably have studied, we're like slow and dumb sometimes.
But there's still progress,
so,
right? It's not like we haven't advanced.
There's,
it's just slow.
Yeah, so we're just slow. So, yeah. But anyway, at the end of each podcast, I ask every single guest if they would read Shelley's Ozymandias, because this poem, people talk about it. People have named shows after it. People are very influenced because they think it's, I don't know, like just hearing people talk about it, it's either called special or super deep, and people don't really know what to do with it other than they feel it hits them in, a certain type of way. So I'm curious to see you as both an Egyptologist, but also a scholar of the ancient world. I would love to know whether you agree with people about this poem.
As regards its impact?
Yeah. I mean, just honestly, general thoughts. Like it's a cold poetry reading for a reason.
Fair. I think it is important, and I do like poetry. I think poetry is in some ways a method of breathing life into the ancient world, right? And poetry as a literary form is very old. So I think it's a beautiful poem, and I think it is important. I am not a literary scholar, so it's hard for me to talk about its impact. It didn't necessarily impact me and why I studied Egyptology or anything. But I think it's a wonderful way of creatively expressing your interest in something, in this case, the ancient world. And of course, the statue of Ramses the Great that it is based on is incredibly impressive and worthy of many poets. So I do think it is an awe-inspiring sight.
I would very much agree with it. But yeah, okay, let's have you read the poem, and then we'll get to the fun stuff at the end.
I met a traveler from an antique land who said, 2 vast and trunkless legs of stone stand in the desert. Near them on the sand, half sunk, a shattered visage lies, whose frown and wrinkled lip and sneer of cold command tell that its sculptor well those passions read, which yet survive stamped on these lifeless things, the hand that mocked them and the heart that fed. And on the pedestal these words appear, my name is Ozymandias, King of Kings. Look on my works, ye mighty, and despair. Nothing beside remains. Round the decay of that colossal wreck, boundless and bare, the lone and level sands stretch far away.
I can tell people I'm clapping and snapping in the background over here because I love this poem. Do you remember how old you were when you first read it?
Oh gosh, no. Ages and ages ago. It was sort of one of those things that was vaguely, I knew about it. I had read it. I probably read it in high school. It was sort of a perception of antiquity thing that I thought, oh yes, I know about that. And it didn't figure prominently. I'm so sorry. It's a great poem. It's nothing against the poem.
No, I'm just curious because I definitely don't remember when I first read it. I think it was high school. Now it could have been college, but I'm pretty sure it was high school. But one of the reasons I think I was drawn to it, other than the amazing imagery, right, of ancient Egypt and the sands and this idea of a broken statue of a once great pharaoh, was as a political scientist now. And it's so weird for me to say that I'm a political scientist because I don't feel like when I'm like, no, I'm a classicist, but I did just pick up a master's in poli-sci. So technically I'm a political scientist too, I guess. But like reading into the poem, I was like, oh my God, it's so political. Shelley was writing like a political treatise in 14 lines, right? It's a commentary on the fact that it was based off a statue that was found in Egypt that was coming to be in the British Museum in 1818. So I was like, colonialism was at its height. But also other things were happening. And just based on kind of where the world was at that point, I like to think that it's a statement on monumentality, and it's a memento mori kind of thinking about it then, thinking about it now. It applies in so many different cases, and it's quite political. I mean, it really is a statement, right? And of we think this civilization is so great, this culture, this empire so great, and it's going to last an eternity. And yet at the same time, we see with the benefit of hindsight that it hasn't. And it's very interesting because I'm like, I don't know. Was Shelley thinking about this when he wrote it? Was he thinking from the perspective of Ramesses? Like, what was going on in his mind? It's super political. All the themes of legacy and stuff, they pull right through. And so in the context of that, right, the last question I ask every single guest who comes on my show is, think for 1 minute about our society right now, the world as it is right now. Do we have a modern Ozymandias, something we think kind of is like so great and amazing, and we think it's going to last for eternity? But also realistically, are humans in, let's be generous and say 500 years, 1,000 years from now, would they have the same opinion? Would they agree with us?
This just popped into my head. I feel like our Ozymandias is our phones, because we live on those. And I mean, the iPhone, I think, is the most culturally recognized one, but any smartphone, we live on those. Everything is on them. We bank on them. We interact with the world on them. And I think it becomes the center of our universe so frequently. And I think, assuming we don't all die off in the next couple 100 years, which seems likely given how much we're trashing the planet, I think that in the future, if people find the phones and things like that, archaeologists of the future, they will probably be a bit confused and wonder why there are millions and millions of them and waste broken ones everywhere. And I think it would be hard to convey how much of our lives depend on these little handheld devices. Because I'll be honest, my first thought was architecturally, but I think architecture doesn't impact our life in the same way necessarily as it maybe it used to, right? Because there's architecture everywhere. There's monumental architecture all around the world. I think our lives revolve around our smartphones. We do have a tendency as a species to think that this current moment we're in, this current society we're in, can never die, that it's immortal, which of course is nonsense. All societies fail. This is all of them. But I think phones have given us this feeling of omnipotence. And I think, I'd be really curious what a future archaeologist would think of that. Like this is the wreck of a society where everybody had, over the course of their life, many of these little devices. But I don't think they would understand the impact it had on our day-to-day, in a sense.
Yeah, I agree. I mean, I often think about the future, well, in the sense of what would future archaeologists find. I mean, I'm like, look, man, if something happened and then it went all Planet of the Apes and then the world was covered in whatever, I just like the idea in my head of when future archaeologists dig up like our massive statue of Mickey Mouse. They're going to be like, these people were crazy. They were worshiping a big mouse. Like, was this their god? All these great things. So we have a lot of weird things in society that I'm very excited to see. Well, I'll never see, but I wish I could see what future people thought of us and our crazy ideas and all these things. So I did kind of lie. There's one more question I'm going to ask you, and that is, where can people find you if they want to follow your work, your research? Send your friendly email with a bone question. Who knows?
So I do have a website, although it's fairly straightforward. It's just my name, Roselyn A. Campbell. I also have, if you're interested in reading some of my academic work, I do have an academia page, academia.edu. And if someone wants to read my work and it's not posted up there, always, and this applies to all academics, just send them an email. We normally love to share our work, but we're not always allowed to post it publicly because of copyright. But if you send me an email, I am always happy to send you a copy of an article or something like that. I am also the assistant director of the UCLA Luskin Center for History and Policy. And we have another podcast called Then and Now, and that's actually pretty cool. I don't do all of the interviews, but we interview historians about sort of the history and context of issues that are relevant today. So I did an episode with Kara about authoritarianism and patriarchy from ancient Egypt to Donald Trump. I just did an episode about reproductive rights in colonial Mexico, and then of course modern like Roe v. Wade discussions. So we do have that podcast and events as well. But yeah, I mean, if you go on my website, I am on Twitter, but I'm a bad academic and I don't post very much on Twitter, so that's I'm not very good about that. But you can my email is easy to find, and I really do try to answer all my emails. It's a struggle, but I do try. I don't mind cold emails at all. I've emailed people cold and got great responses, so I'm always happy to talk to someone.
Great. Well, we will make sure that we link all of these wonderful things in the show notes so people can find it. And yes, I will put your Twitter there. So if anyone wants to follow you because of Classic's Twitter and other sort of networking platforms, they will be able to. Thank you so much for coming on my show. I've been wanting to do this forever, and I knew it would be a great conversation, and it did not disappoint. It's been so fun. I wish we had more time, but like always, I tell all my guests this. Please, you'll have to come back because I'm not done talking to you.
No, it's been so fun. I really enjoyed our conversation, and I'm happy to come back. Yeah, no, this has been really great. Thanks so much for having me.
Trireme Transit is now departing ancient office hours. Next stop is Present Ponderings.